With each episode, I'm sure Dr. Heiser inspires you to go back and study your Bible. But how do you actually do that? Where do you start, and what tools do you need? Hi, I'm Johnny Cisneros from BibleWordNerd.com, and in partnership with Dr. Heiser, I've created an online course for you called How to Study the Bible with Word Studies. In this course, you'll learn the essential concepts, tools, and methods to find those nuggets of insight in the Bible. To enroll in the course, go to BibleWordNerd.com. That's BibleWordNerd.com, and there you'll find our special pricing and bonus offers.
You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 127, our 17th Q&A. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, how are you doing?
Good. What's new? Anything?
No, nothing's new, although as this episode's out, we are currently in the conference right now, so hopefully we're doing good by scoring a lot of good interviews.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, we went with some scheduled and see what we come out with.
Yeah, I think it'll be good. I can't believe, though, this is our 17th Q&A. Mike, probably with every answer you give, you create 30 more questions. So
yeah, we're gonna run into a little bit of that probably today. We always do. So that's, what can you say? People ask good questions and it just generates other areas. So
yeah, absolutely. But hopefully
I'm unrepentant there.
As you should be. Hopefully they'll have enough information, though, the breadcrumbs, to go follow the trail, and we appreciate you doing it. And I guess, Mike, we've got about 7 or 8 questions for this show, so you just want to jump right in?
Yep, let's go.
Our first one is from Matthew, and he just listened to episode 97, and in that episode, Mike mentions that seraphim indicate an Egyptian context, and the cherubim a Babylonian context. In light of the above, do the cherubim in the tabernacle and temple represent a Babylonian context for this cult elements and not the genuine Egyptian context of the Exodus?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. Probably something that I could have clarified a little bit whenever that was, episode 97, whenever that happened. But the short answer is no, not necessarily. The issue here is the origin of the term keruv, cherubim, all that sort of thing. Now, Akkadian, again, this is a term that, as far as anybody in the field can discern, based on comparative parallels, the language. The term comes from Akkadian, and Akkadian was known in ancient Egypt in what would have been the Mosaic era. Akkadian was kind of like English is today. It was the language of international correspondence. So Egyptians are going to naturally be exposed to it. Moses, again, giving the biblical description of his context, would have had a pretty good education. So this is something that wouldn't have been new to him, wouldn't have been something that he couldn't have known, wouldn't have been inaccessible to him. So it's conceivable, again, that the writer of the tabernacle, temple text, Moses, whoever, and then, of course, later on when you get into temple material, they certainly could have used the term. It would have been part of their vocabulary. So the issue isn't something like, a writer can only be using this vocabulary if he's like living in or around Babylonians or Mesopotamians or Akkadians or whatever. The issue is this word in their vocabulary? Well, it obviously is because they use it. But what is the history of the word? In other words, we know that it is in their vocabulary, but where does it come from? And in this case, it comes from, Akkadian. So that's probably the question is good because it calls for a little more clarification of that. So whoever wrote this material, Akkadian, had become this, at least this term had become part of the Hebrew vocabulary at the time. Now, I should also mention in regard to this, again, if you're following what I just said, that doesn't require the events of the Exodus or the setting of the tabernacle or the setting of the temple to be a Babylonian one. In other words, it doesn't rule out the historical contacts and the contexts of these events that the Bible is describing. Again, the discussion is just about the term. Where does the term come from? Some scholars would, you'll find this particularly in older scholarship. You won't find it so much now, but some will take a look at the ark and the cherubim, the cherubim on the ark, and they'll compare that to Egyptian palanquins. And you say, well, what's a palanquin? It's a good Scrabble word here, Mike. Palanquin. A palanquin is a box. Okay. Again, this is a podcast. It's an audio thing, so it doesn't really translate well to what we're doing here. But if you just Google palanquin, Palanquin, you're going to find examples, and a lot of them look like the ark, again, except for the lid, the cherubim on top of the lid, but it's a box. And inside the box, you could have idols and statues and whatnot. They were either dragged around or carried around, on carts or wagons or by people, in different ceremonies in Egypt. And because of the Exodus story, has this Egyptian context, a lot of people have thought of, well, one of these palanquins was probably the template for the ark. Well, there's a bit of guesswork in there, maybe in terms of design, architecturally, if I can use that term here, that might have some validity. But that doesn't mean, for instance, that some palanquins who have the images of Isis and Nephthys on them, they're both winged goddesses, that's where Moses is getting the inspiration for the cherubim. Isis and Nephthys were not throne guardians. Okay, they're not creaturely. The cherubim are not described as feminine, for instance. And in fact, the term, again, is an Akkadian one. It's not an Egyptian one. So you can't press the point of comparison too much. But in terms of the visual, a box, well, okay, maybe this is what they were thinking of, or, Moses had seen one of these before or something like it. You get the box idea. Maybe you can draw some parallels but not the term. The other thing is, too, you can't press a lot of this too far, because if you extend this to the tabernacle, where you have a tent dwelling, well, that's very Semitic, this idea of the deity, sort of living in a tented structure. Again, thinking of the sort of a patriarchal analogy, Yahweh being sort of the patriarch or the divine council sort of thing. Well, again, you get that flavoring. So what you actually see in the Hebrew Bible is kind of a mixture. You have, again, cultural points of contact, Egyptian, maybe the palanquins or the tented structure, the tabernacle. And then you have linguistic points of contact. Here you have an Akkadian term that winds up, being the term of choice, for this particular feature, of the Ark of the Covenant. So there's all sorts of cultural and linguistic contacts, points of contact going on here. You never just have one particular context, especially if this is your setting, this part of Israel's history. So this was a good question, again, just to talk about some of these other things. So don't be misled into thinking that there's this one point of contact here, and then the narrative or the story has to be read against that one point of contact. And especially if it's language related, we don't know when Karuv would have entered the Hebrew language, the Hebrew lexicon, as it were. We just know that it did, and we know where the term comes from.
All right, Bob has a question. And his question is, do you think that Paul in Romans 1:26, for their women exchange natural relations for those that are contrary to nature? Is Paul thinking contrary to nature only in terms of same-sex relations, as unquestionably described pertaining to men in the next verse? Or is this a reference to Genesis 6:2? In the Genesis account, it doesn't say the sons of God forced themselves on the daughters of men. Could the daughters of men have willingly exchanged natural relations, human male-female relations, for those that are contrary to nature, human-divine relations, and this is what Paul is referring to.
Well, this is the timing of this is really interesting. I was just talking to David Burnett a couple of days ago, texting actually, and he has a friend who is doing work in this area. I can't recall if the guy is doing a thesis on this, Romans 1, or if it was a paper or something like that. But this fellow, and Burnett gave me the gist of his argument, so we're trying to get a hold of this paper that he did, because I told Dave I was really interested in it. But his argument is that both Paul and Peter link false teaching and idolatry to the Genesis 6 and Sodom events in that order. Now, this is sort of an old trajectory when it comes to 2 Peter 2. In fact, it's pretty easy to see there. If you go to 2 Peter 2, verses 4 through 6, we read, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus, hell in this translation, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction," so on and so forth. So you get a reference there to, the angels that sin, and there is no other Old Testament story for that. Angels plural, okay, that sinned. This is not like some Lucifer event or whatever. It's very clear this is a reference to Genesis 6. And then on the heels of that, you get the reference to Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, this is part of Peter's diatribe against, false teachers. So it's very easy to see that Peter thinks of those events in that order in going off, on the false teachers that he's addressing. Well, the question is, does Paul do that too? And this fellow is arguing, just as the questioner sort of asks or presumes, this question is arguing that Paul does do the same thing in Romans 1, because you have the women, again, exchanging, again, natural relations. And then you have the men, again, with the homosexual, again, unnatural relations there. So if the one is possibly a reference to Sodom, then the previous one, the women, it would make sense to view that as a reference to Genesis 6, or at least striking at those 2 points of analogy. Now, I'll say right now, I'm going to sort of suspend judgment on this. I haven't really seen a good case yet made for this, but I'll be honest and say this hasn't received a whole lot of attention. So I'm really interested in this guy's thesis or whatever it is. And so I'll just say, to Bob, our questioner, I'm not sure. I think it's possible. Let's just go there. I think it's possible. I'm not persuaded yet, but that might change again after I have a read of this, and hopefully that'll be soon, because this was a very recent conversation between David and myself. So he's trying to get me access to this, his friend's work, and we'll see if that happens.
All right, Jeff in Lancaster, UK, ask, I would appreciate if Dr. Heiser could look at 1 Corinthians 8, verse 4 through 6. How would he respond to Paul's teaching here that there's no God but one, and the other gods, whether in heaven or earth, are called so-called gods?
Yeah, I think this is a really good case where the English translation, and in this case even the typesetting, biases readers. In a lot of translations, you'll go to 1 Corinthians 8, and you'll have gods in scare quotes, many lords in scare quotes. That sort of predispose the reader into thinking, okay, this is sort of a fairy tale kind of thing that Paul is now going to deny and go after. I actually addressed this in Unseen Realm, so I don't know if the questioner has a copy of Unseen Realm, but my response to this is basically I'm going to read part of what I put in Unseen Realm in relation to 1 Corinthians 8. So I pointed out that in the discussion in 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 6, Paul does acknowledge that there are other gods, theoi. If you go to 1 Corinthians 8, he says, now concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up, so on and so forth. Verse 4, therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence. Well, Paul's right. The idol itself isn't alive. And we know that there's no God but one. Okay, well, that's a statement of the uniqueness of Yahweh, the God of Israel. We know that's true as well. But then Paul follows that by saying, for although there be many so-called gods in heaven or on earth, indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there's one God and Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist. So in the space of 3 verses there, he affirms that, yeah, as indeed there are many gods, theoi, and many lords, kurioi. Paul affirms that they're real, they exist. But for us, there's one God, the Father, and of course there's one Lord, Jesus Christ. But then he has this language about, so-called gods in heaven or on earth, and we're a little bit biased when it says so-called. The term there is just the normal word lego, which means to say or to call, to speak, that sort of thing. So the reference is really there are many gods in heaven and earth that people name as their gods. That's all it's saying. So to translate it so-called as though you're supposed to doubt it now is really an injustice to a very common, simple term in the Greek New Testament, lego. You should really look at verse 5 and say, for although there are many gods in heaven and on earth that are called gods, and indeed there are many gods and lords, yet for us there's one. So the idea is that there are many other rivals to Yahweh that people sort of worship and assume are better than the God of Israel, or sort of the real one, or up there. Any number of ways that an idolatrous person, an idolatrous population would have looked at their gods. This is all Paul's saying. There are lots of other deities that people assign worth to, that they believe are true gods in the sense that this is the one that deserves our worship, and so on and so forth. Well, Paul says, yeah, that's all true. It's all true, but for us there's one, and there's one Lord, so on and so forth. So right away we're biased in the translation by the scare quotes. We're biased by translating lego as so-called instead of just saying called. Okay. Yeah, the little word so in front of it, and it biases the reader. So I have a bone to pick, again, with the way the term's translated, but going back to what I said in Unseen Realm, Paul acknowledges that there are other gods and other lords among people who did not belong to Yahweh, and of course to Jesus. Well, we know this because this is what the state of the affairs that the nations are under. This is the Deuteronomy 32:8-9 worldview. And again, if either the questioner or people listening to the podcast don't have any idea what I'm talking about here now, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and go to Start Here and watch the video on the Divine Council worldview, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, because I can't take the time in the podcast to do that. But so assuming that you know what I'm talking about here, I wrote an Unseen Realm, taking Paul's comments in both, this is important, in both 1 Corinthians 8 and 1 Corinthians 10 together is important because the subject matter is the same. So we have here in 1 Corinthians 8 this reference to other gods and other lords and the food sacrificed to idols. And so people read this and they're biased by the scare quotes. They're biased by rendering lego so-called instead of just called or named. And they think, the gods aren't real. Paul didn't think the gods are real. Well, you got a real problem when you get to 1 Corinthians 10 with that, because he discusses the same subject matter. And there it's quite a different story. So for Paul, when you get to 1 Corinthians 10, this is when he's talking about, well, don't eat the meat because then you'd be in fellowship with demons. And in 1 Corinthians 8, he more or less says, oh, who cares if you eat the meat, because we know that idols, this isn't a real deity. This block of wood and stone, this isn't a real deity. It's not alive. It's just a piece of wood or a piece of stone. So who gives a rip? Okay, whatever, do what's right in your own conscience, 1 Corinthians 8, verse 7, and you're okay. But then he changes his tune in chapter 10. He says, well, don't eat because then you're going to be in fellowship with demons. This is 1 Corinthians 10, 21 and 22. You say, well, is Paul contradicting himself? The answer is no, because in 1 Corinthians 8, he's talking about the idol. Okay, it's not real. It's not alive. But there are other gods and other lords, but for us there's one. 1 Corinthians 10, he's talking about the entities that are behind the idols that people use to worship those entities. Paul's actually very consistent when he says, don't eat the meat because you don't want to be in fellowship with demons. So if you're going to deny the entities are real in 1 Corinthians 8, then you have to deny that the daimonion, the demons in 1 Corinthians 10 are real. And Paul obviously believed demons were real. So you can't deny the language in one to affirm the language in another. It's totally contradictory. And the real kicker here is that in 1 Corinthians 10, when Paul does talk about the demons that are really behind these objects, people are just using objects to worship these deities. That again, Paul acknowledges even in chapter 8, there are many gods and many lords, okay? They're using these objects to worship them. When he talks about those deities, and he calls them demons in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 21 and 22, where does he get that? He gets it from Deuteronomy 32. He's taking the language from the Septuagint translation of Deuteronomy 32:17, okay, which says, again, talking about Israel, Paul's actually tracking on Deuteronomy 32 through the whole chapter in chapter 10, or a big section of the chapter. Deuteronomy 32:17 says that the Israelites sacrificed to demons that were not God, that were not Eloah. It's a singular word, God. They sacrificed to demons, Shadim, that were not God, to gods, Elohim, they had never known. And that was a problem for Paul. And Paul doesn't want believers in Corinth to fall into this trap. So don't sacrifice to the daimonion. Don't eat this meat. And so the way you reconcile these two things is that apparently, if you go to 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says, don't do this. But then he says, okay, if it's sold in the marketplace, go ahead. So the issue for Paul must have been doing something that made you sort of part of the ritual, made you sort of part of the sacrifice, made you a participant in the event of the sacrifice. That to him was where the line needed to be drawn, because then you'll be just like the Israelites. You'll be sacrificing to the daimonion, to the shadim, if we want to use the Hebrew term, and that's an abomination. These are gods. These were gods. The Israelites didn't know. They weren't for the Israelites. They were assigned to the other nations. Again, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, Deuteronomy 32:8-9, just a few verses earlier, before verse 17. So Paul isn't contradicting himself, and he's not contradicting the Old Testament. He's actually trying to tiptoe through this issue for the Corinthians and saying the issue isn't the meat. It's not the act of eating. It's not the meat itself. The issue is don't do anything that makes you a participant with these entities that Paul considered real, because, hey, the Israelites considered them real. The biblical writers considered them real. These other Elohim, don't do that. That is a violation. That was Israel's downfall, and we don't want this to happen to believers now who are following Christ. Don't do this. So you can go to Unseen Realm, sort of get the whole picture there. I give in footnotes a number of works that show how Paul tracks through Deuteronomy 32 in, again, a larger section of 1 Corinthians 10, because he's comparing, again, the believing community there in Corinth that he's writing to, Christians, the church there, to the Israelites. We don't want to happen to you what happened to them. And he gets to this whole thing about the demons, and he says, boy, you just got to avoid this. You just must avoid this, because they are real. Indeed, there are many gods and many lords, but for us, our allegiance is to one, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist. And our allegiance is to one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. Again, Paul is actually really consistent in the way he approaches this, but when you get to certain translations of 1 Corinthians 8, and then you get to chapter 10, you think, this guy can't make up his mind. And it's because you've been biased to think a particular way in chapter 8 that doesn't work real well when you get to chapter 10.
All right, our next question is actually from two different listeners. They're tracking on the same thing. They have a question about Melchizedek. And Sean in West Virginia asks, could you explain what views and beliefs early Christians or earlier Jews had about Melchizedek? Who was he? What was the significance of his relationship with Abraham and his relationship with Christ? Is there an understanding or perspective that those early believers had that gets missed with us? And Jessica echoes the same stuff. She wants to know if there's some biblical traditions about Melchizedek, and I assume he's a divine being since it says having no beginning and no end, but I know there's special significance since Jesus is referred to as a priest after him, not the Levites. Or is Paul perhaps just describing him as another embodiment of Yahweh, like the angel of the Lord?
Let me just make one quick note here. The questioner sort of assumes that Paul wrote Hebrews. Paul, and he may have. Nobody knows who wrote Hebrews, but outside of Hebrews, you don't have Melchizedek referred to in the New Testament. All the references are in Hebrews 5, 6, and 7, most of them in 7. But it doesn't really matter, for the sake of the question. The short answer is, and this whole subject is a mess. The short answer is, what did ancient Jews, think about Melchizedek? Oh, lots of things. There is no one view. There are several views, and they are at many points, mutually contradictory. The whole Melchizedek thing is a really difficult topic because there are so many ambiguities in both testaments about who this guy was and why he's even mentioned. I would say the topic deserves, I was going to say one episode. I actually think Melchizedek deserves to be 2 episodes on the podcast. One Old Testament, basically Genesis 14 and Psalm 110, and then the next one, a follow-up on Second Temple stuff in the New Testament. So we should do that. We should devote a 2-part mini-series to Melchizedek. But here I'll make a few comments. And Trey, you said at the beginning, sometimes the answers generate more questions. Well, that's what we got here going on. And Melchizedek's sort of like the poster child for, this is really messy, messy stuff in Scripture in terms of our understanding and what we're able to really discern and feel confident about. There isn't a whole lot here. So the difficulties could be summarized this way. I'll just list a few. First, we have an Old Testament description, this is Genesis 14, which has several clear attachments to a Canaanite context. That is an extra biblical context, a non-Israelite context. So because that's the case, how we think about Melchizedek, if we're just in Genesis 14, is going to be different than the way we think about Melchizedek, even in Psalm 110, and especially in the New Testament. So we've got a bit of a disconnect there. Second, if you go to Psalm 110, that has some notorious textual problems. Psalm 110 is probably on a short list of passages that has the most text critical problems in the Hebrew Bible. You got Psalm 68's got a few doozies. You got Psalm 22's got a few doozies. And you go to Psalm 110, again, it's going to be in the short list of passages that have some really gnarly things going on that matter for interpretation. Some of the key phrases associated with Melchizedek are where some of these problems are. Third, you've got several Melchizedek traditions in Second Temple Judaism, in intertestamental Judaism. And again, at points, they do not agree with each other. Fourth, you have Hebrews 7. There are things you read about in Hebrews 7 like this, without beginning or end kind of thing, that you just won't find in the Old Testament, and you won't even find them in other Second Temple Jewish texts. So how are we supposed to take this? Fifth, again, just sort of a general summation, you've got disagreements between all 4 of those preceding items I just listed. There is no consistent picture. And so that, again, has created kind of this maelstrom of what do we do with Melchizedek? Again, it's a really, really difficult, thorny issue. I'm going to give you some examples here. I don't want to just create a list and then not give you specifics. So a few examples. The name, let's just start with the name, Melchizedek. You think, well, surely that's simple. It means king of righteousness. Well, if you're paying attention to Hebrew morphology, in other words, the spelling of the name, it shouldn't mean that. The reason is if you've had Hebrew, you'll understand this. But so for those in the audience who've had, it breaks down to Melchizedek. Now you'd think you have a simple construct chain there. Noun 1, noun 2, X of Y, but you don't because of the E, the Y ending on the first noun, Melchizedek. By rule of Hebrew grammar, you are not supposed to have an attached suffix between two nouns in the construct state, but that's what you got here. So you can't really translate it King of Righteousness. It would be better to say my king is righteous. It's kind of the same idea, but it's not really the same idea. King of righteousness, my king is righteous. Those are two related but kind of different concepts. So even the name is controversial. In fact, if you want to be really literal, you could translate it, and many scholars do, as my king is Tzedek. That's the second noun there that some would translate righteous or righteousness. My king is Tzedek. And you say, well, why would scholars do something goofy like that? Why not just go with my king is righteous? Yes, they can be grammar nerds and say we can't say king of righteousness, but let's just go with my king is righteous. What's this thing with my king is Tzedek? That's just odd. Well, there's actually a Canaanite deity named Tzedek. And since this is pre-Israelite, this is the era before Jerusalem, king of Salem, before Jerusalem became Israelite, before David's conquest of it. We're not in the land. We don't have the promised land thing yet. This is Abraham in Genesis 14. This is Canaanite turf. So Melchizedek could have been named after this non-Israelite deity. Okay, I'm Melchizedek. My king is Tzedek, this pagan deity. Well, then why is Abraham being blessed by him? Who is Tzedek? Is this another name for Yahweh? Are Yahweh and Tzedek maybe the same in the Israelite thinking? In Israel, again, just the name gets you into all these areas that are just really gnarly. They're not easy. Second example, if the Messianic priesthood is from Melchizedek, okay, this is Psalm 110 stuff now, why do we have an Aaronic priesthood? Other than Psalm 110, where does this idea even come from? In other words, where did the psalmist get it? I mean, the guy who's writing Psalm 110, where does he get this idea? Because we don't have a priesthood of Melchizedek in the Old Testament, in the Torah. We have the Aaronic, the priesthood of Aaron in the Torah. And a sub-issue is where's the link to the line, of Abraham in Genesis 14? I mean, you just get all sorts of these complications when it comes to this person. DDD, for example, Dictionary of Deities and Demons, says this about Psalm 110, at least some of the Psalm 110 material. It says, Melchizedek's priesthood is defined as, or the person in Psalm 110, this kingly figure, his priesthood is defined as in or after the manner of Melchizedek. The exact meaning of this phrase is hard to establish. It's a nice understatement from DDD. Continuing, it says, it may mean in the line of Melchizedek, in other words, inheriting the priesthood of Melchizedek. It could mean like Melchizedek or on account of Melchizedek as well. Probably the formula shows that the kings of Israel, beginning with David, inherited the tradition of the priest king or pre-Israelite Jerusalem. This connection between kingship and priesthood apparently did not last very long, since no king of Judah was called priest and allusions to priestly conduct are limited to David and Solomon. You get a few episodes like the 2 Samuel 6:14, verse 18, 2 Samuel 24:17, 1 Kings 8:14, and 8:56. So you get a few references to David and Solomon doing priestly kinds of things, but you don't have that with anybody else. And if beginning with David, you have this inheritance of this other priestly line, why did it go away? Was there something wrong with it? Why, and again, back to why do we have an Aaronic priesthood? Why in Israelite history is there no tradition after Solomon? And even there's really not a tradition even for David and Solomon that they were viewed as king priests. Okay, why is that? There just seems to be some disconnect going on here. Third example, Hebrews 7. Elements of that, as I mentioned, can't be found in Genesis 14 or Psalm 110 or even Second Temple Judaism. You get a portrayal of Melchizedek and Philo. You get Josephus talking about him. And you get a text that's especially interesting called 11Q Melchizedek. This is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a non-biblical scroll. That one is really interesting because in that text, 11Q Melchizedek, it's also called 11Q13 in the numbering system. Melchizedek is considered to be the God, Lord of the Council of Psalm 82. Now, again, anybody who knows the material we do in the podcast, Psalm 82, the Divine Council stuff, is going to know what Psalm 82 is about. Well, 11Q Melchizedek has Melchizedek as being the one who presides over the council. Now, that in and of itself is just kind of crazy, kind of bizarre. I'll read DDD again because it comments on this text too. In the Qumran text, Melchizedek is mentioned twice. Once in 1Q AP Genesis 22, that's the Genesis Apocryphon, which again is sort of a version of Genesis 14 events, and also in 11Q Melchizedek, which consists of 13 fragments. In that text, Melchizedek plays a central role. The many gaps, the lacunae in the text make a conclusive interpretation virtually impossible. The text has the form of an eschatological midrash, in other words, sort of an eschatological riff, on Psalm 82, in which the liberation prophesied in Isaiah 61 is described in terms of the restoration of property during the year of Jubilee in Leviticus 25, and the deliverer is Melchizedek, who is the Elohim of Psalm 82. So you got 11Q Melchizedek drawing stuff from Isaiah 61, which Jesus quotes, remember, when he's at the synagogue, this day this has been fulfilled, and, setting the captives free and all that stuff. 11Q Melchizedek quotes that passage, Leviticus 25, and Psalm 82, and puts Melchizedek right in the middle of that. So that raises the question, is Melchizedek, to some Jews, was he the Lord of the council? How does that jive with Genesis 14? Did the Jew who wrote 11Q Melchizedek, didn't he read Genesis 4? I mean, how do you get there? Again, on one hand, 11Q Melchizedek shows us Jews could think, though, in terms of a God king who was also a priest. Now, that sounds suspiciously like Jesus, doesn't it? But again, this is a secular, a non-biblical, it's not part of the Bible, a text, but it's a text among the Dead Sea Scrolls that was interpreting certain passages in the Old Testament in ways that the New Testament interpreted certain Old Testament passages thinking about Jesus. Again, so 11Q Melchizedek has drawn a lot of attention, but you don't have a specific alignment between it and like Hebrews 7. You just don't. You have a few points of contact, maybe touch points, but they don't really sort of interact with each other. And obviously they can't because Hebrews 7 is, written much later, but you get similar kinds of flavoring to it. I mean, I could go on and on. Let's one more last phrase here. This whole idea of without beginning or end. What do we do with that? Well, there are, in other Greek literature, the same words there, the vocabulary there. Those terms do get used of divine beings in other Greek texts. And so that creates, again, the question of, okay, is Melchizedek to be viewed as divine here, as a divine being, non-human, or at least more than human, that sort of thing? Is this a clue? And if it is, how is that consistent with Genesis 14 and Psalm 110? Maybe, again, this is just one proposal, we're just throwing stuff out here. Maybe Melchizedek and the Son of God, Jesus, maybe there's a type-antitype thing going on here. Maybe the point of Hebrews 7 isn't to do exegesis in Genesis 14 or in Psalm 110. Maybe all he's trying to do is strike analogies. And maybe he's thinking those two things, the Son of God, Jesus, and Melchizedek, are analogical because of Jewish traditions that we see in 11Q Melchizedek, where you have a divine, kingly, priestly sort of figure there. In other words, that whole set of ideas was part of at least, some Jewish thinking between the Testaments. And so maybe the writer of Hebrews, again, understood that or had been exposed to that and says, aha, I've got the real answer here, and the real answer is in an analogous relationship between Melchizedek and Jesus. And to really throw a wrench into this, some would say, well, he's not really doing the analogy between the Melchizedek of the Old Testament and Jesus. He's doing the analogy between Jesus and 11Q Melchizedek itself, which would really throw a curveball into things. So again, this is an extremely complicated subject that we'll return to this, and we'll do 2 episodes on it, because there's so much here that you can't really do it justice or really resolve anything in a Q&A.
My mind is blown.
This is why there's been more than one dissertation on Melchizedek.
We're gonna hold you to that 2 episodes, because that'll be a
2
good
episodes. It'll take 2.
All right, looking forward to that. All right, our next question is from Peter. What do you make of Psalm 45:6, where the psalmist addresses the king as Elohim? Is this a sign that Israel's king, pre-resurrection and pre-glorification, was already considered part of the divine council? Of course, Hebrews 1 makes much of this verse and applying it to Christ. Mm-hmm. I'm curious how it might be understood in light of the divine council worldview.
Yeah, I in real general terms, I would say that the trajectory that Peter mentions in the question about the king already, it's sort of an already not yet being considered part of the divine council, I would say that that's possible because believers are talked about in that way as well. It's just that you get some sort of possibly an explicit notation of it here in Psalm 45. Now, I want to take this in a different but related direction as well. On my website for the book, moreunseenrealm.com, if people go up to that and click on the tab or the chapter for chapter 4, I actually talk about this passage on that website. And so I want to read a little bit of what's on the website. And this is going to be a little tough to translate to people in audio form. So I would recommend, if you are listening to this and you can pull out a Bible and be looking at Psalm 45 here, it might help, because it's going to be a little hard to follow, perhaps. But you can always go up and read this later. So, because I'm just going to read what I have at More Unseen Realm, chapter 4, part of that page here. So the question presumes that the psalmist's statement, and this is typically the way it's translated, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." The question presumes that the psalmist's statement must refer to the Israelite king, and refer to the Israelite king in that way. In other words, addressing the Israelite king and actually saying, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." So that's the presumption behind the question. Now, some will take that presumption and then argue that Elohim refers to humans, and then they try to get the gods out of Psalm 82 and lots of other passages. Of course, the problem with that is, even if it's true that the psalmist is referring to the king as Elohim, it's the king. It's not the Israelite judges, and it's not every human. So let's say that it's an illogical argument to use this verse against there being gods, divine beings, in the divine council in Psalm 82. And of course, then you have also the problem of Psalm 89, the councils in heaven, and so on. This doesn't help. This doesn't help demythologize Psalm 82, even though some people try to. And basically, their arguments are only effective for people who are listening to them and not thinking. It's just a bad argument. Now, where I'm going to take this here, and again, just go to moreunseenrealm.com. There are those who say, well, that's really not the way Psalm 45, verse 6 should be translated. Golden Gay. Okay, I'll just start reading here. Although it seems little known, the original orientation of Elohim in Psalm 45, 6 and 7 could coherently be God himself. This is possible depending on how one takes the stanzas in the psalm, also called kola, the plural of colons. That's scholars speak for stanza. I use the word stanza because I think more people can identify with that. Poetic stanza, poetic line. So depending on how you take the stanzas, how you divide them up and what belongs with what, you actually come out a different place where the language is referring to God himself and not the king. That's possible. Golden Gay, who is an evangelical Old Testament scholar, he's written a lot of stuff, frankly, in his commentary on Psalms, which is multi-volume, but he says of this psalm at this point, he notes the structure of the psalm statement, and he actually renders verse 5 and the first part of verse 6 this way. Now listen. Your arrows are sharpened, peoples are beneath your feet. They fall in the heart of the king's armies. The throne, God's, G-O-D apostrophe S, the throne, which is God's throne, is yours forever and ever. So speaking to the king, but speaking about God himself, not calling the king God. That is a perfectly legitimate translation of Psalm 46, verse 5, and the first part of verse 6. Golden Gay then offers some comment, for his translation here. He says, as the king acts in the pursuit of truthfulness and faithfulness, expecting to see God doing marvels, then opponents will fall before him. On any reading, the order of the kola, these stanzas, is jerky. Many English versions reverse some of the phrases to make the text read more smoothly. Aha! Verse 5 is yet another pair of four-stress kola. What he means by that, this is me interjecting now. What he means by that is you have a poetic line and there's an accenting system that the Masoretes apply, not just in poetry. They have an accentual system throughout the Hebrew Bible, but the accenting system for poetry helps divide up the kola, the stanzas, and for the translator, at least the Masoretes are showing this is how we would group things here by virtue of this accenting system. So Golden Gay says, verse 5 is another pair of four-stress kola. There's four accents in the kola, with the second clause in verse 5a forming a parenthesis. The they refers to the arrows. The declaration in verse 6, the first part, 6a, then closes off these comments about the king's power. His victories reflect the fact that he sits on God's throne. And he has a cross-reference here, 1 Chronicles 29, verse 23. Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king in place of David his father. So the king sits on God's throne, ruling Israel on God's behalf, and is destined to rule the world on God's behalf, Psalm 2. That in itself would make the king's throne last forever. The fact that God made a lasting commitment to the Davidic king's throne would also have that implication. So what he's saying here is he's saying, look, the translation that he offers makes sense, both in terms of the Masoretic markup and theologically. I'll read it again to you. This is how Golden Gay translates it. Your arrows are sharpened, peoples are beneath your feet. They fall, the arrows, fall in the heart of the king's enemies. The throne, God's throne, is yours forever and ever. Again, what Golden Gay would say is this is a reference to the promise to David. And he's not calling the king God. He's saying the king sits on God's throne. So if you take it that way, then the question, again, is really both answered and kind of done away with. But what prompts the question, of course, is typically the way English Bibles, many of them, and Golden Gay, this is Golden Gay's language, this isn't mine. English translations will rearrange some things to make it sound smoother, and you come out with your throne, O God, is forever and ever. And that generates this question of why is the king being called God? Well, the answer is, the Hebrew text might not have meant that at all, and probably didn't. Again, I'm with Golden Gay on this. I think it makes a lot of sense what he's saying. So I needed to read through that rather than just saying, well, that's just not the way it's translated, and I like this other one. There's really good reasoning behind it to link it to the Davidic covenant and also to take the stanzas for what they are within the Masoretic tradition of accenting and grouping them. you don't have the king called God in that case.
All right. Our last question is from David in the UK, and he wants to know if anything unclean gets destroyed in sacred space, how come Satan is safe in God's presence in Job?
Well, I'm not quite sure where the question is coming from, because I don't really know of anything unclean getting destroyed in sacred space. Maybe the questioner's thinking of the Nadav and Avihu episode, Leviticus 10, the strange fire kind of thing. Because if something was defiled, in other words, made impure, and was therefore ineligible for sacred space, the typical procedure in Leviticus wasn't that God just sends a lightning bolt down and destroys it or destroys the person. There's a procedure to go through decontamination. So I'm not quite sure about the first part of the question, if anything unclean gets destroyed in sacred space. I'm not quite sure what he's talking about there. If it is Leviticus 10, Nadav and Avihu, again, that has a context, so I'd recommend going back to the Leviticus series and looking for the episode on Leviticus 10 and listening to that. But let's just go to the second part of the question. How come Satan is safe in God's presence in Job? I think a lot of listeners could probably anticipate what I'm going to say here. The Satan in Job 1 and 2 is not the devil. Okay, we don't have a problem here with the devil, capital S, Satan, being safe in God's presence in Job 1 and 2, because that isn't the devil. For a video on this and the results of text searching on this, go up to drmsh.com. And if you type in the search engine there, Satan, and maybe the word Job, you're going to find a couple posts that relate to this issue. Just to summarize what you'll see there for the sake of listeners. The reason I say this isn't the devil in Job 1 and 2 is because in every instance in Job, and also in Zechariah 3, the word Satan is prefixed by the Hebrew definite article. Definite article is the word the. By rule of Hebrew grammar, and in the video you'll see me flip out to a Hebrew grammar so that you know Mike's not just making this up. It's a Hebrew reference grammar, and anybody who's gone really past first year in Hebrew knows this. But by rule of Hebrew grammar, Hebrew, like English, does not prefix the word the, does not prefix a definite article to proper personal names. It never happens. So in English, the English example is, I'm not the Mike. Okay, Trey is not the Trey. We're just Mike and Trey. We don't use, because English, it sounds idiotic because this is the way English grammar works. English does not use a definite article before a proper personal name. Hebrew is exactly the same. And so this is a rule of Hebrew grammar. What that means is Satan in Job 1 and 2 is not a proper personal name. It's not capital S Satan. Even though English texts translate it that way, they present the term that way. And frankly, let's just be honest, they do that because it would freak people out to not do it. People are so used to reading it in older translations, like the King James or whatever. They're so used to hearing about the devil, capital S Satan in Job 1 and 2, that if you don't represent it that way, nobody's going to buy your English translation and they'll think you're a heretic. It's just a concession. Now in the ESV, and the ESV is not the only one, but if you go to ESV and you go up to Job 1, like in verse 6, the first time you have the term mentioned, there'll be a footnote. And the footnote, I'll just read it to you, says Hebrew, the accuser, or the adversary. So throughout chapters 1 and 2. So it ought to be translated, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser also came among them. In other words, it strips out the proper personal name. It's a title. It's an office. It's a person, a being, an entity in the divine council that gets a little uppity, and we know the rest of the story, about the confrontation or the conflict between God and Hasatan, the Satan, the adversary. But this is not the devil of Genesis 3, Garden of Eden, or the devil of the New Testament. And so the question has to be answered that way. and so Satan isn't safe in God's presence in Job because it's not Satan. It's not capital S Satan. It's not the devil. Now, if you have Unseen Realm, I'd recommend that you read the part of the book where I discuss Luke 10:18. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. I think, again, that is probably more pertinent to the kinds of things you might be wondering about by virtue of this question. But as far as Job 1 and 2 goes, this isn't the devil. And so there's no issue of the devil being safe in God's presence.
All right, Mike, just like that. That's all the questions we have for this episode.
Okay.
And I guess, Mike, next week, we're going to be releasing the conferences, interviews that we have over the course of Thanksgiving week. Those are here in America. So I guess everybody have a good Turkey Day.
Yeah, well, we're planning on it. So
and be prepared to be peppered with a bunch of interviews from hopefully from the conferences. So eat some turkey and listen to some podcasts.
Yeah, don't play any music while you eat. Play the podcast while you eat.
And again, I guess I need to do my yearly challenge, and that's to expose somebody to this content. Thanksgiving's a good time talking to family members and friends that you haven't seen in a while. So maybe you can kind of slip in the divine counsel worldview in there somewhere. And
let's skip the politics and do the divine counsel.
Oh, perfect. That's exactly where I skip the politics and just get straight to getting naked. Ask them if they're interested. Get naked.
I was thinking of something more edifying than that, but
okay. Well, you
go
should
ahead.
know better from me. But anyway,
I'm learning.
A good conversation starter. So, so I guess, Mike, with that, we thank you for answering our questions and look forward to all of the interviews in the conference. And everybody in America, have a good Turkey Day. And I guess with that, thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.